The lack of centralized decision-making in terrorist organizations makes it particularly difficult to track who sent an actual order. Is this all the way up from the caliph of the Islamic State himself? Is this a, ISKP chief? Is this an ISKP cell chief there located in Russia? It's hard to tell who it would have came from. And that's also where it gives room for people to question whether Ukrainian, Western, U.S. intelligence may have been involved. Because when you have so many layers of compartmentalization, decentralized decision-making, it's easier to sneak your way in there and then launder any involvement through a number of subsidiary intermediary groups. But indeed, it's not entirely strange that even regular non-aided Islamic rebels from the Islamic State would try and flee to Ukraine. There's a great 2020 article actually from Ukrainian independent media talking about how Ukraine has been a travel hub for Islamic State fighters for years now. It's a known problem because unlike some other countries in the region that really crack down on people trying to transit to and from Syria and other Islamic State-controlled territories, Ukraine had a much more open flow. And in fact, eventually the CIA and I believe it was Georgian intelligence tipped Ukrainian authorities off and caught some high-profile Islamic State leaders that were hiding out in Ukraine. Wow. And that's also, aided by the fact that it was easy to find black market Ukrainian passports, especially after 2014. And so, Ukraine's not a brand new hub for Islamic terrorism. And so even if we do take the ISKP angle at face value and accept it as a story, that doesn't necessarily mean that there wasn't a Ukrainian connection, even if it wasn't a Ukrainian government connection. Putin talked in his speech about how it appeared they were fleeing to Ukraine and that they had some sort of compatriots in Ukraine who would create a window for them to enter the country. Now, you could interpret that as Ukrainian special forces, intelligence services doing it, or it could be a sleeper cell of the Islamic State that's already located in Ukraine who would have created some sort of diversion or otherwise allowed their entry to the country. And so once again, these juggling meta-narratives can lead us in different directions, but we just have to be really careful not to just pick confirmatory evidence, lead into confirmation bias, because even with the somewhat vague statements that have been made, we can be led in different directions kind of based on what our presuppositions are. And in this case, I think the responsible answer and take is really just we don't know. We're not on the ground. There's an informational fog of war. We don't have access to KGB phone records and calls I'm sure they're going back to listen to. And we don't have access to whatever intelligence the U.S. is making to justify its claims. The Biden administration was very, very clear from the very start that Ukraine had absolutely zero involvement. And Russia rightfully asked, well, how can you be so sure? If you can make such a confident statement, surely you must have information to vindicate that statement. But as of now, they have not given any reason for their assessment that Ukraine was not involved.
What was kind of like the way that the Chechen Wars informed, at the same time, Putin's rise to his dominance as the leader of Russia?
One thing that I think people in the West, particularly in the United States, have to understand Putin's rise is just how chaotic and unstable Russia was in the 1990s. After the fall of the Soviet Union. Obviously the Soviet Union wasn't necessarily the greatest place in the world to live, but post-Soviet fall 1990s Russia was somewhat of a hellscape. Organized crime ran rampant. People lost all their savings. Opportunities and jobs were hard to come across. There was lots of alcoholism. Russia's life expectancy, especially among men, plummeted following the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so in that sort of chaos, Russians really wanted to seek stability. They wanted a stable leader. And although, Yeltsin's competency is hotly debated, whether he was a useless drunk or just kind of an unfortunate man left with rebuilding Russia after the fall, Yeltsin was not what the Russian people necessarily wanted. And so there on January 1st, turn of the millennia, 2000, Vladimir Putin came into power. And from there, he really leveraged his perception of stability as a grounded leader, someone who really cared about Russia. And he used that to his advantage to really cement himself with the Russian population. I believe it was a week or two ago, the George Washington University National Security Archives released a U.S. Embassy assessment from 2001, 2002, I believe, where they openly say that Russians really do strongly support Putin, Partly because he's, I believe they called him a giant among midgets. That is that he was a somewhat decent leader among a array of really bad choices for leaders otherwise.
Okay.
And as well that at the very least they thought that he could protect their pensions and that he could, mitigate the chaos of organized crime that had been, prevailing there in Russia. And so Putin did take on the oligarchs. Now you can argue, did he just integrate them into the Russian government fold, or did he truly eliminate them as a presence? You can kind of take either perspective, but either way, he reined in the oligarchs who had taken advantage of the chaos of the 1990s Russia. And he brought, moreover, Russia to a higher standing on the world stage. Obviously, they weren't the number 2 superpower. It wasn't a bipolar world anymore, but they restored somewhat of the international respect and prestige that Russia had once enjoyed.
It's a very peculiar desire to, I think you're right, the military and industrial complex being an incentive of it, but also maybe perhaps, and I really wonder what you think about this, is just like an anti-Russian sentiment that just hangs on generationally, that you have a generation that was just taught that Russians themselves are just warmongering bad people. And until we kind of exercise out that presumption, the voting public is largely going to be responsive to propaganda that says, well, I mean, who cares what Russia thinks? They're just a gas station with nukes. We're going to do what we need to do to protect ourselves from the boogeyman of Iran, or we can't let those guys into NATO. They won't help us. They're bad guys, by nature.
I think that is very much true, because with the fall of the Soviet Union came the collapse of the job market for so-called Kremlinologists. You had these scholars, these national security officials, these intelligence workers who had spent, years, decades of their career focused on countering the Soviet threat. And once that Soviet threat was gone, they either had to invent a new threat in which they could be a specialist, or they'd be out of a job. And so that's where we saw the remnants of that Cold War era anti-Russian, anti-Soviet diplomacy leak over into the subsequent generations. And I think that's also reinforced by the fact that much of our diplomatic corps, much of our national security and intelligence apparatus are all from these elite schools with professors who hold those same sort of views. It's a feedback cycle. It's an echo chamber, which is why, I myself studied Russian at the University of Montana, not your traditional Russian studies, big notable university, but it was a really, really interesting place to learn about Russia because it was kind of outside of the fold of traditional US-Russia relations studies, your typical international relations school there, your George Washington universities and your Georgetowns, your Johns Hopkins, all those places, I believe, to this day, especially after the spark of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, they've really doubled down on that position because they get to write a bunch of books and articles for money about this. They get to make media appearances about it. Mm-hmm. Whereas if we had gone down the route of integrating Russia into the Western fold, those people would only have peace to talk about, and peace doesn't get clicks and views, nor does it get them bigger paychecks for bigger programs.
I have to go out of my way nowadays to find anything out about Russia, right? It's just part of the current censorship industrial complex world we live in. And I found some stuff on Russia today that was very interesting to me because I think and I don't know if it was Russia Today translating what happened into something that'd be compelling for Western audiences. Obviously, that's kind of the role on the global stage as a media company. But what they said was, quote, "No unfriendly nations for Russia, only unfriendly elites," which sounds very like global elite kind of Trumpian kind of language, right? And then adding that the Russian government, quote, "has never tried to cancel culture, any foreign artists or cultural performances. On the contrary, we believe Russian culture to be part of the global one, and we take pride," and then brackets, "in this fact." And that's a very interesting one, right? Because it kind of leans into a liberalism from the American point of view, a diversity as a strength of like a Russian unity that is then a multiplicity in itself as well. And I just to double into what your point is, because I think it's actually reflecting in news headlines right now.
Yeah, well, and that's part of Russia's position as, yes, it sometimes plays into its perception as a conservative bastion for Americans and people in Western Europe. But at the same time, Russia tries to appeal to the global South, to the developing world, as a bastion of multipolarity, as a place that's accepting of a world where all sorts of countries have a say and can kind of independently run their own systems. Russia, their not official ideology, but their kind of de facto ideology is called sovereign democracy. And that's kind of an idea that they try and push, which is that every country and every people deserve to have a say on the world stage based off of the determination of their own nation, of their own citizenry. And so they're oftentimes going to, South America, the Middle East, Africa, and they're portraying themselves more along the classical Soviet anti-colonialist, anti-imperialist, anti-Western sentiment and playing into that. Whereas they don't really take that angle as frequently to English-speaking and Western audiences, just because there's different interests to play into there, and so it is kind of a split messaging. But at the end of the day, Putin really does seem to believe and take pride in Russia as a multi-ethnic nation, as a nation rich in culture and art from a variety of people, and that's just geographically true.
Can you kind of unpack what maybe he means by denazification?
It's absolutely both angles that he's taking there. One is he's definitely playing into the historical memory of the Russian and the post-Soviet peoples, as well as the modern angle of these Ukrainian paramilitary groups being openly supportive of National Socialism. So to go back to a point you made there, Russians call the Second World War the Great Patriotic War. And that's because when you look at the death counts, both civilian and military, it's really not comparable, the Eastern Front to the Western Front. The Eastern Front was just an absolute bloodbath, both for the Germans and for the Soviets. And the Soviets and the post-Soviet sphere, and by extension Russia, take great pride. So when you go around the streets of Moscow or St. Petersburg or even Novosibirsk out in Siberia where I was, constantly you run across streets named after Great Patriotic War generals and officers. You're constantly running across different memorials, different statues to the same sorts of figures and heroic deeds. When you go through Russian Wikipedia, I swear half of the Wikipedia pages for people are just of random soldiers and officers from the Second World War. And so even though World War II has definitely become a big part of the American mythos and our national identity, it's amplified and even greater for Russia and the post-Soviet sphere. Now, much of the fighting happened, not necessarily in Russia proper, but there in Ukraine and Belarus, in these areas that are between where Nazi Germany was and Moscow. And so that's where you have a similar anti-Nazi spirit in places like Belarus and much of Ukraine, but you also had many partisans and many groups in those countries who, due to Soviet oppression in the 1930s, ended up siding with the Nazis. You had mass starvation, you had political repression under the Soviet leadership. And so when the Nazis came, and they were presented as a sort of liberator, many of these groups there in Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltics, ended up siding with the Nazis. Now, that partisan warfare extended well after the end of the war in 1945 in places like Ukraine. And Russia has ever since had a true vendetta against anything resembling Nazism.
Just so listeners remember, because I think we're on the same page, but I just want to make sure this is what you're referring to is was what we found out. Was it a year ago that Israel was actually trying to broker a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia, and with Turkey, between Ukraine and Russia, but Britain flew in. Boris Johnson. I almost said Yeltsin. Boris Johnson flew in and disrupted it on behalf of probably the foreign powers to keep the war going, basically promising Ukraine that you're going to be able to kick them all out. When obviously that was BS.
Yeah, and the big Russian contention, the big ask that's really going to be part of any end-term negotiations, I believe, is going to be assurances that Ukraine will not join NATO. It's really what it has gone back to for years, ever since that nyet means nyet memo came out, where, now CIA Director William Burns, then ambassador for the U.S. to Russia, said that it was the Kremlin's firm belief and policy that no means no regarding Ukraine's entry into the NATO sphere. once again, this whole situation could have, at least in theory, been avoided by starting negotiations early on in Putin's reign to bring Russia into a security pact. Now, you can always argue, as many people do, that Russia would never have actually agreed. They would have made too ridiculous of demands and wouldn't have been arguing in good faith. Well, okay, if that were the case, we still should have let it play out, and then we could have exposed this lack of willingness to negotiate in good faith. But I personally believe that they would have at least made a reasonable offer, one that could be negotiated on. Mm-hmm. And then we could have had, a lack of fighting within NATO members as much as with NATO members and outside forces. So that's one thing that people often look over with the NATO alliance is they say, well, it's kept peace and security around the globe, by intervening in these various conflicts, by acting as a dissuading force. But more importantly, really, especially from the European perspective, is that it has prevented conflicts within members. NATO members don't fight other NATO members because that becomes a much bigger problem than it would be otherwise. And so if you were to fold in countries like Russia into this, you would, in theory, be decreasing the odds of any peer-to-peer conflict there with Russia by virtue of the fact that you share a common security infrastructure, a security pact with them. And so, how those negotiations would have ended up, I don't know. Mm-hmm. But now we don't really have the opportunity to go back and start considering that, at least for years at this point. I would love for that to be back on the table, but It doesn't seem entirely likely at this point. And similarly, ideally, I think we should have, as the West, supported very transparent elections, referendums there in eastern Ukraine in 2014 or even after, in order to try and really determine how the people in these regions speak. As a libertarian, decentralization is kind of always the goal, breaking down government into smaller and smaller and smaller territorial local units. And so that's why, in theory, I'm not opposed to the breakaway of a state of Ukraine, regardless of how new the national identity may be, as long as there is a genuine, non-coerced, non-manipulated will by the people to form such a political entity. Mm-hmm. But by the same standard of sovereignty we give Ukraine, we have to apply to those regions in the east of Ukraine who may not necessarily want to be part of that Ukrainian state that broke away. They may want to break away into their own political entity. But we ruined any chance to have such elections, any such referendums, because we instantly decried any efforts to do so as pro-Russia. And as you noted, the human toll of it cannot be lost, right? It's something that I myself, as someone who's inundated in the 24/7 news cycle, I often lose sight of all the bodies that stack up there in Ukraine, the trenches, whether they're Ukrainian soldiers, Russian soldiers, civilians, it doesn't matter. Every single one of those is a loss of human life. And it's the loss of a life of someone who's far more intimately tied to the conflict and the information thereof than any Western consumer, any NAFO cheerleader on the sidelines, doesn't have a shred of the informational accuracy that someone dying on the battlefield does about the whole situation. Their feelings, are not nearly as relevant as those who might be willing to go charging into a trench for one cause or the other. And it's something that I think greatly pains Ukrainian and Russian people more than it does in the West. That's something when I listen to interviews with Ukrainians on the ground, when I listen to interviews of Russians on the street of Moscow or anywhere else, they're almost always most concerned about the fact that they are killing a people so close to themselves.